BBOR Black Box Online Radio, coming to you from West Virginia at heart and from around the globe. And hello, everybody. Today is Wednesday, another Ripper Wednesday. Welcome to the show. On Wednesdays this year, I've been talking to you guys about Jack the Ripper, perhaps the world's most famous unsolved murder mystery. And in this episode, I will be responding to Jack the Ripper and Encyclopedia by John J. Eddleston. And this is a very comprehensive book. It covers many different aspects of the Ripper mystery, but there is a section that is dedicated to the suspects. And the reason why I wanted to talk about it on Ripper Wednesday is because he ranks the suspects on a scale of 0 to 5, 0 meaning absolutely not or almost certainly not, even though he does say that 0 is no chance, so I will use his metric, and 5 would be a suspect who is worthy of strong consideration. And I've done something similar with the Zodiac mystery. Every Monday I do an episode about the Zodiac killer called just that, Zodiac Monday, and I've done suspect ratings in the past. I've ranked them on a scale of 1 to 10, 1 meaning very unlikely and 10 I have never actually had anyone who's a 10 out of 10. 10 out of 10 for me would be the Zodiac Killer. I thought this was an interesting metric to use, 0 to 5, but I will use his ratings here, and I will respond to them. And for this episode, I'm also going to choose the suspects that I've covered here on Black Box Online Radio for Ripper Wednesday, and there are going to be a lot of suspects that I'm not going to be talking about, but perhaps I can do a future episode when I look at all of John J. Eddleston's comments about them. I'm going to give you guys some precursors, and the first one is that Charles Lechmere, a widely discussed Jack the Ripper suspect, is not mentioned in the book, also known as Charles Cross. He is not discussed on this suspect list, but more importantly, I was really bummed that Chaim Hyams was also not included. I was quite curious what John J. Eddleston had to say about that Jack the Ripper suspect, because Charles Lechmere is discussed in a lot of contemporary conversations, and it appears that this is in older text. But there's a Jack the Ripper suspect out there named Joseph Barnett, and, I have even said this on Ripper Wednesday. I put him in my top 4 suspects when I did my own suspect ratings episode for Ripper Wednesday. Joseph Barnett is referred to as a friend of Mary Kelly, who was the final victim of Jack the Ripper, and in other sources he's referred to as her ex-lover, her ex-boyfriend, but it appears that they had some type of personal connection, and I'm going to read the description here, or the profile that has been written out for the suspect, Joseph Barnett, from John J. Eddleston. Joseph Barnett, put forward as a candidate most notably by writers Bruce Paley and Paul Harrison. The story is that Joseph Barnett was upset that his lover, Mary Jane Kelly, was a prostitute, and then after reading about the murder of Martha Tabram, he used the story to scare her off the streets. Unfortunately, the plot worked only for a short time, so Barnett hit upon the idea of murdering the friends of Mary Kelly in an effort to control her. The story is full of holes. To begin with, it is given the supposed fact that all 5 canonical victims knew each other, and Harrison goes on to say that they all lived on the same street and drank in the same public houses. There is no evidence to support this. Well, I should throw in some interjections. The reasons why I thought that Joseph Barnett was a Jack the Ripper suspect is purely centered on his connections to Mary Kelly, and I'll just restate it now. I think that Joseph Barnett is a very strong suspect for the murder of Mary Kelly. Yes, it's the whole concept of blame the ex-boyfriend, but sometimes that person is the perpetrator. There's a reason why people look toward somebody's ex-lover, and I don't think we have to accept the full package theory of he's creating this set of murders to scare Mary Kelly off the street because he had some type of obsession with her. And I think that that is getting a little bit too specific. That's bordering on mind reading. In all seriousness, it's not even about who committed the murders at that point. It's what was he thinking when he committed them. And I do think that that theory is a little bit far out. But again, that's not the reason why I thought highly of Joseph Barnett as a Jack the Ripper suspect. I thought highly of him because he matched the psychological profile created by John Douglas around age 30. He also had The speech disorder echolalia, I mean, some call it a disorder, some just call it a phenomenon, where if somebody were to say a word, then he would repeat the sounds or verbiage of that word. And Joseph Barnett was also a fishmonger. He was very good with a knife, but not a medical doctor. And I will just go back to John J. Eddleston's response here. This entire theory depends on the idea that the motive for the murders was jealousy, which it plainly wasn't. Well, how do you know that? I mean, if it's an unsolved case, how do you know that that wasn't the motive? That all the victims knew each other, or at least knew Mary Kelly, which they weren't, and that Barnett came up with the idea of a series of murders to persuade a woman not to sleep with other men. This is an idea worthy of Agatha Christie, not the real world. Joseph Barnett gets a 1 out of 5, and that's on a scale of 0 to 5, so he thinks very unlikely. Again, the full package theory, perhaps 1 out of 5, but Joseph Barnett is a Jack the Ripper suspect himself. I think he should be listed as much higher because you have to differentiate this with the Ripper suspects. And the same with the Zodiac Killer and D.B. Cooper, the other cases that I talk about here on Black Box Online Radio. You have to differentiate between the two questions. Number one, was this person Jack the Ripper? Number two, do you endorse the full package theory? Now, as far as this concept of how the women who were killed by Jack the Ripper, like Polly Nichols, Annie Chapman, Liz Stride, Catherine Eddowes, and Mary Kelly, all living on the same street and all knowing each other, Tom Westcott has explored this in his book, Ripper Confidential, and he points out that at times they did stay at the 18 George Street guest house and the 19 George Street guest house. He can connect every female victim to those two lodging houses in London, so that is on the same street, and that might be what they're referring to. It doesn't mean that they were there at the same time or that they were even there for very long, but some point in their lifetime. I just wanted to throw that one out there as well. But that's a take on Joseph Barnett, 1 out of 5. What do you think? And I put him a lot higher on the list, but that's just me. And as I said, I also talk about the Zodiac Killer and Jack and Ripper and D.B. Cooper here on this channel. The Zodiac episodes come out on Monday. The D.B. Cooper episodes come out on Friday. And if you want to follow along with all of these true crime discussions, you can hit the like button and subscribe. It really helps out the channel. You can also go through some of the links in the description box. One of them is for buymeacoffee.com. Buymeacoffee.com/blackboxnerd88. And that allows you to make a donation or contribution to help support the show, and anybody who makes a donation will get a shout out on Zodiac Monday. And now I'm able to tell you that Black Box Online Radio will be available on Spotify, and you can download this program, take it on the go anywhere and anyhow, and the older episodes have been archived on Launchpad 1. Now, the next suspect that is in John J. Eddleston's Encyclopedia is William Henry Bury. William Henry Bury was a convicted murderer, but I'm going to read this right here. Along with suspects such as George Chapman and Dr. Cream, William Henry Bury is one of the few that we know to be a murderer. In fact, like Chapman and Cream, he was hanged for the crime and has been suggested by the writer William Beadle that he was Jack the Ripper. And the long story short is that William Henry Bury was hanged for the crime of his wife, for murdering his wife. And it continues here by saying, he faced his trial on March 28th and on April 24th of 1889. Okay, on March 28th he faced the trial, and on April 24th of 1889 he was hanged in Scotland. The case against Bury is that the murder started after he moved to London and stopped after he left. He was a known thief, and we believe that Jack the Ripper stole things from the victims. Well, Jack the Ripper stole things from the victims. He also took their organs. Okay, so William Henry Bury fits the psychological profile, he fits the general description, and the writing and the tenement showed that someone else, possibly Ellen, believed him to be the Ripper. After William Henry Bury's wife was murdered, there were some clues that were written, or there was writing that was written in the home that talked about Jack the Ripper. I remember that from when I did the episode on him. But let's keep going here with the psychological profile and the comments from John J. Eddleston. So, overall, William Henry Bury gets... Actually, I will read one more thing. William Henry Bury may have failed to demonstrate the coolness of the man we seek for Jack the Ripper, but that alone is not enough to discount him as a possibility for the Whitechapel Fiend. He certainly deserves a closer look. The suspect rating for William Henry Bury is a 3 out of 5, and that is very strong. I think that that's very, very high. If this list is from 0 to 5, if these ratings are from 0 to 5, I'm giving William Henry Bury a 2 at the most, generously a 2, more honestly a 1, because, okay, yes, he's a convicted murderer, but the way that he went about it is just so completely different. He forced his wife's body into a box, he broke her legs because she wouldn't fit into the box, and Jack the Ripper didn't commit crimes like that. He attacked women in dark alleys, he cut their organs out, and with the murder of Mary Kelly, her body was absolutely eviscerated, her intestines were pulled out and left on a nightstand table, she was cut down to the bone, and there's a difference between mutilating the body and breaking the legs to force someone into a box, because, and you talked about psychological profiling, that is someone who is not very concerned about people finding the remains. That type of personality is going to be lower in neuroticism than somebody like William Henry Bury. He would have been someone who would have been more worried and more concerned about people finding the remains, finding the body. So this is just a very, very different homicide. And in all seriousness, I think that this just was committed by a different person. So I would probably even give him a 1. Now there is one person that I talked about when I did the Jack the Ripper report on this channel, and I would talk about a lot of different subjects. And as you see, I'm just going in alphabetical order because this list is arranged in alphabetical order, and it's not necessarily the suspects that either Eddleston or I think highly of, and his name is Lewis Carroll. The writer was seriously suggested as a candidate by Richard Wallace in his book Jack the Ripper, Light-Hearted Friend. After research based on deleted passages from Carroll's diaries held at the British Library, Wallace claimed that the deleted sections contained comments on the murders. Charles Lutwidge Dodgson, whose pen name was Lewis Carroll, was 56 years old at the time of the murders and spent much of the autumn of 1888 at a summer cottage in Eastbourne. We are expected to believe that he regularly caught night trains to London, so he could have committed the murders. The suggestion is without foundation, and he gets a 0. Yes, ultimately I would probably give him a 0 using this metric. I mean, this is just a wild theory. However, there is another piece of evidence, and it talks about the deleted entries from the diaries. What Richard Wallace would point out is that Lewis Carroll wrote his diary in purple ink, but he claims that on the days of Ripper activity, he switched from purple ink to black ink, although I haven't seen those with my own eyes. That's just another aspect of the theory. And there is another Jack the Ripper suspect, though, that I would like to stay with that's on the same page, and his name is George Chapman. George Chapman was an alias that he adopted, or it was a name that he took on, and George Chapman was a real serial killer called the Burrow Poisoner. He was from Poland, his real name was Severin Klasowski, and he, again, was a murderer. He was convicted for this, and he was hanged for his misdeeds as the Burrow Poisoner. And I would just like to look at the comments that have been made here by John J. Eddleston. It has been suggested that George Chapman was Jack the Ripper. The only evidence for this claim is that George Chapman was in Whitechapel at the time of the murders, operating a barber shop in Cable Street, and that he had also been seen when he was also seen arrested by George Godley, and Inspector Aberline remarked, "I see you've got the Ripper at last." This is certainly untrue because Aberline later responded that he became suspicious of George Chapman only during the trial, not at the time of the arrest. Well, Eddleston, I'll give you that point for paying attention. It should be remembered that whoever Jack the Ripper really was, he knew the dark alleyways of Whitechapel very well. Then 22-year-old stranger from Poland, would he have really known the alleyways? It is also unlikely that someone who butchered prostitutes with such ferocity would later turn to poisoning his victims. In addition, Chapman lived far to the east of the center of the murders, quite a distance even from the Elizabeth Stride murder in Berner Street. His coloring did not match any of the descriptions of the man seen in the vicinity of the victims, and it is believed that throughout his adult life he sported a bushy black mustache. In short, the evidence is tenuous or non-existent. Well, even after saying the evidence is non-existent, I mean, John J. Eddleston still gives him a 2 out of 5. The evidence is non-existent. I mean, I would probably give him a 1 out of 5. But, one of the reasons why I do this segment is you can look at how people are thinking and look how at the ideas that they've put forward. And even though I don't think strongly of George Chapman as a Jack the Ripper suspect, let's look at some points on this list here. I mean, firstly, I will share one that I do agree with. I think it's unlikely that the Ripper would have switched from mutilating the victims to poisoning the victims, but that Klasovsky, aka George Chapman, couldn't have become familiar with the dark alleyways of Whitechapel. Now, he was living there at the time, and every person is different. Some people can live in a town for 20 years, and they won't know which way is north and which way is south. Other people will live in a town for 2 weeks, and they can learn all about the back ways. And you can even see this when you go out with groups of people. Like, say, for example, I used to have this group of friends, and I was the best at finding directions. Like, I would remember where things were, I would remember points of reference, and they would just turn to me to find places because I would remember the way. I had a reasonably good sense of direction. But then we met somebody new, and this person had a much better sense of direction than I did, who was able to remember the places and the points of reference and the walking path way better than I could. And it was just like, wow, I felt like, I have just completely lost all the time because that person was so spot on with everything. And that person had only been in that city for, again, about 2 weeks. Some people can learn this stuff very quickly. Like, they can learn how to run around the little back alleys of London very fast, and others are very slow. I don't think that should be a point against him. And also this part here, that the murder of Liz Stride in Berner Street was very far to the east. Let's see, let me just read this. In addition, George Chapman lived far to the east of the center of the murders, quite a distance even from the murder of Elizabeth Stride in Berner Street. I don't think anything of that at all. I mean, there could be explanations about how somebody can go across town. I don't think that's a strong point either. But ultimately, I would be giving George Chapman a 1 out of 5 as opposed to a 2 out of 5, simply because I'm seeing him committing crimes in completely different ways. George Chapman murdered his wives. He was the borough poisoner. He murdered women whom were specifically close to him, but in a way that doesn't have a single hallmark of Ripper activity. And what I believe this just goes to show is that George Chapman was a different type of serial killer who operated after the Ripper murders. The borough poisonings happened after Jack the Ripper, and there can be more than one criminal in a city. Now, that's just my take on the subject. So, there is a Ripper suspect out there going next on the list, and his name is David Cohen. And David Cohen is a rather difficult suspect to talk about because I just want to be clear that I'm going to come back to him because John J. Eddleston is putting him under a different name. David Cohen's name could have been Kaminsky, and I'll come back to him later on, but he's an important suspect to talk about. By the way, though, one of the suspects in this is Dr. Thomas Neal Cream, and I have a standalone episode about him on this channel. And Dr. Thomas Neal Cream was also a poisoner. He was the Lambeth poisoner, but he was incarcerated in America at the time of the murders, allegedly, from 1881 to 1891, convicted for the murder of Daniel Stott. And John J. Eddleston gives him a 0. I give him a 0 as well. Now, there is a Ripper suspect that I haven't talked about in a while, and his name is Thomas Cutbush. Thomas Cutbush, I'll just read the segment here from the Encyclopedia. The nephew of the superintendent, Charles Henry Cutbush, Thomas Cutbush was detained as a lunatic on March 5th of 1891, escaped from the Lambeth Infirmary within hours. He was free for 4 days, and during which he stabbed Florence Grace Johnson in the buttocks and tried to do the same to Isabel Fraser Anderson. Arrested on March 9th, he was charged with malicious wounding and committed to Broadmoor Asylum and died in 1903. Cutbush was first mooted to be the Ripper by the Sun newspaper on February 13th of 1894. The claim was thoroughly investigated by the police and led directly to the penning of the McNaughton Memoranda in an effort to refute the claims. It is surely impossible to reconcile that the sadistic murders of Jack the Ripper with two relatively minor stabbings years later. In addition, Cutbush was only 23 at the time of the murders and lived in Albert Street, Kennington, some distance from the Whitechapel area. Well, already I've talked about the distance. I mean, people can find ways to get across town. Let's just say that. But this thing about how this guy is so sloppy with his crimes. He stabbed two women in the buttocks, one successfully, one unsuccessfully. He gets a 0 on John J. Eddleston's suspect ratings. I agree. I would also give him a 0. Then Thomas Cutbush really holds his place in history because he is the one who prompted the McNaughton Memoranda, as you heard, written by Inspector Melville McNaughton as a direct response to the article from The Sun in 1894, and that was when McNaughton listed 3 suspects whom he thought more highly of than Thomas Cutbush, and their names were Kosminski, Osfrog, and Montague John Druitt. And there's a very lengthy section about Montague John Druitt here in this encyclopedia, so I'll get to him right now. And Montague John Druitt was a lawyer, and he worked part-time as a teacher with a school, and he committed suicide perhaps around early December of 1888. But I'm going to read a segment just from the end of this section on Montague John Druitt. Perhaps the last word should be left to Inspector Aberline, who in 1903 did an interview with the Pall Mall Gazette and referred to the story of the Ripper, and saying that the Ripper had drowned himself in the Thames. Yes, I know all about that story, but what does it amount to? Simply this. Soon after the last murder, in Whitechapel, the body of a young doctor was found in the Thames. But there's absolutely nothing beyond that, and he was found at the time that could incriminate him. Chance of being Jack the Ripper, a 1. He gets a 1 out of 5 from John J. Eddleston. I mostly agree with this, and, it's odd that he would refer to Montague John Druitt as a doctor, because, as I said, this is also stated in the McNaughton Memorandum that Montague John Druitt was a 41-year-old doctor, but all contemporary sources refer to him as a 31-year-old man, not 41, and that he was a barrister and school teacher, not a doctor. And I've really tried to be generous in the past and just say, well, in the United States, if someone's a lawyer, we call them a JD, Juris Doctor, but I really don't think that's what's being discussed here. So I'm not really sure for those. Now I'm going to be talking about a different Jack the Ripper suspect in just a second. And this one is going to be presented in a rather different way. This one is George Hutchinson, and he is more famous for being a Jack the Ripper witness, a witness who may have seen Jack the Ripper walk with Mary Kelly, the final victim, on November 9th of 1888. And this is, I'll just read the whole thing here. This is from John J. Eddleston's Encyclopedia, and here's the entry on George Hutchinson. George Hutchinson was a witness who came forward at the inquest of Mary Jane Kelly after it had ended, to give a detailed statement of the man he claimed he had seen with Kelly on the morning of her death. By morning, they mean after midnight. The statement is far too detailed to be considered reliable, and one has to ask why Hutchinson made it. Some writers have argued that his testimony may have been nothing more than a publicity stunt, seeking attention, but an equally strong argument that he came forward after he had learned about what had happened in Miller's Court by Sarah Lewis. Hutchinson lived close to the epicenter of the murders and was the right age and height, and given what we know of the physical description, he may have matched the composite picture of Jack the Ripper. By composite, I think they mean metaphorically. Hutchinson is a very strong candidate who is discussed later on in this book, and this is something that truly shocked me. George Hutchinson gets a 5, and he will be the highest rating. That is the highest rating, 0 to 5. Now, that doesn't mean that John J. Eddleston thinks 100% that, okay, then this guy was the Ripper. As I said at the beginning, 5 means worthy of strong consideration. And when I did my suspect rating episode, I gave George Hutchinson a mid-level rating. I didn't use the numbers here on Ripper Wednesday, but I just said that he's a reasonable suspect, maybe not in my top tier, but a reasonable one, because Okay, so he comes forward, and he's a witness, and he tells this wild story with all of these details about a man he saw with Mary Kelly on the night of the murders. So I think there are three possibilities. Number one is that he just told the truth, and they even talk about this on the Barlow and Watts presentations about Jack the Ripper when they're saying that, all right, he saw a man walking with a woman whom he was acquainted. Yeah, you'd get a good look at him too. And that just means that maybe he's telling the truth, and that he actually saw the Ripper and the details he provided were correct. Number two, he was a complete liar, or let's just say not even a liar, that his information was inaccurate. Maybe he lied, maybe he was mistaken, maybe he did see someone, maybe he didn't, that his information is inaccurate, and that's what a lot of people just simply go with. As previously stated, there's the part about the publicity stunt. And then number three, he was Jack the Ripper. Okay, those are three possibilities. And yes, I'm fully aware that the second option incorporates a lot of possibilities intertwined into it. Well, if there are these different possibilities, maybe he's a liar, maybe he's mistaken, maybe he just saw some guy walking with Mary Kelly and he told the truth. Okay, then that means that then there's really a very strong chance that an alternative is possible, and that him being Jack the Ripper only stands about a 33% chance within those realms of possibilities. So, as I said, he's a reasonable suspect. There are reasons to suspect him. Number one, personal connection to Mary Kelly. Number two, suspicions of lying. Number three, matching the physical descriptions and being in the area at the time and all that other stuff that Eddleston just listed off here. However, to give him a 5 out of 5 in terms of a suspect rating, I think that that's a little bit excessive, but and this is one reason why I thought it was so surprising that Joseph Barnett got an extremely low rating and George Hutchinson gets an extremely high rating. But what do you think? You can put your ideas in the comment section down below. And there's also an entry here for George Hutchinson the American. It's actually divided between George Hutchinson the Briton and George Hutchinson the American. George Hutchinson the American was suggested as a possible suspect by the Pall Mall Gazette on January 12th of 1889. He had been a resident of a lunatic asylum in Elgin, Illinois, and he escaped and killed a woman in Chicago, apparently mutilating her body in a manner that was reminiscent of the Whitechapel crimes. He was recaptured but escaped again in 1884 or 1885. There was no evidence that he was in England at the time of the murders. But he gets a 2 out of 5. I'm like, whoa, wait a second. You're going to give these people who were actually in England at the time of the murders 1s out of 5, and this guy gets a 2 out of 5? If I were using his metric, I'd give him a 0. I mean, if you don't even know that he was in the country, and there's no reason to suspect that he was in the country, I would give him a 0, but that's just my take on the subject. Now, the next one I'm going to go over very briefly, but is one that I do have a standalone episode on here on Black Box Online Radio, and that is the Jill the Ripper theory. And this is an overall, all-encompassing theory that Jack the Ripper was a woman. There are different variants of this, but that's how I want to present it. Jill the Ripper. Jill the Ripper is a generic term covering the suggestion that Jack the Ripper was a woman. The usual suggestion, as in William Stewart's book Jack the Ripper, A New Theory, is that she was a midwife or abortionist who had passed through the streets wearing blood on her clothes, without attracting much attention. The strongest argument against this theory is that all the witnesses who saw anyone with the victims described a man, though there is a slight possibility that the killer was a woman disguised as a man. None of the victims have been at ease in the company of such a person, so the proposition is highly improbable. Gets a 1 out of 5. I mostly agree with that. And I told you guys that I would come back to the suspect Nathan Kaminsky. Martin Fido, the Ripperologist and host of the program Murder After Midnight, had a Jack the Ripper suspect named David Cohen. But David Cohen was not his real name, and it was an alias similar to John Doe, a generic name that was given to a Jewish person that was put into an asylum. And his suspect ended up being Nathan Kaminsky, which is almost certainly an anglicized version of the person's real name, if indeed we have connected the dots and even found the right person. And you can see I have some doubts. But, I mean, the reason why I say that is there's a famous Ripper suspect out there named Aaron Kosminski, whom I'll talk about in a second. And, his name is also anglicized from Aaron in Polish. But anyway, let's look at Nathan Kaminsky. Nathan Kaminsky was a bootmaker who lived at 15 Black Lion Yard and was diagnosed as suffering from syphilis on March 24th of 1888 and was treated at a Whitechapel Workhouse Infirmary, from which he was discharged. Martin Fido suggested in his book The Crimes, Detection, and Death of Jack the Ripper that Kaminsky was the real-life Leather Apron and not John Pizer. John Pizer was identified in an error. This idea is based on the fact that Kaminsky's race, occupation, and age are identical to this David Cohen, so the two must be one and the same. The notion in turn suggests that Kaminsky is the real second person suggested in the McNaughton memoranda, even though the name Kosminski was used, but the suggestion is that that was an error. This theory assumes that McNaughton's boast that he knew the killer's identity was the truth. If Fido is correct in naming Kaminsky as Cohen, then his age of 23 makes him a little young for the killings. Nevertheless, he is a more likely suspect than others. He gets a 4. Well, the problem is, though, that John J. Eddleston is openly stating that there are reasons to doubt this, that there are reasons to think that Martin Fido has connected the dots in an incorrect manner. And as somebody once wrote out in a very lengthy comment here on Black Box Online Radio, most likely the McNaughton Memorandum is referring to Aaron Kosminski, not Nathan Kaminsky. And I would definitely give him a rating that is a little bit lower than that, but not by much. I'll give him a 3 out of 5, not a 4 out of 5. And we also have James Kelly on the list. And James Kelly is a suspect who had his own run-ins with the law, and I'll just read the entry right here. James Kelly was born in 1860, which puts him in the right age for being Jack the Ripper. No, I just gotta stop it. I just gotta stop right there. Alright, you're gonna say that James Kelly's born in 1860, so he's 28 years old, and that's the right age for being Jack the Ripper. Yes, that does match up with some of the witness descriptions, but eyewitness testimony is not extremely reliable. Let's look at some of the other suspects that have been talked about, even if it is Thomas Cutbush, or if it is somebody like David Cohen being 23 years old saying that that's too young. Again, if this person has not been identified, 23 is not impossible. Yes, it's contrary to some of the witness descriptions, but we also have somebody like John J. Eddleston saying that there are witnesses like George Hutchinson who might not have been telling the truth. So, how do you reconcile all of this? I don't think that 23 is too young to be Jack the Ripper. Alright, sure, you want to look at suspects that are closer to age 30? Fair enough, more power to you. But to say that that's a strike against somebody for being 23? Not really. A little bit, but not really. And it's definitely not the heart and soul of any type of evaluating criteria, in my opinion. So, James Kelly was born in 1860, which puts him in the right age for being the Ripper. An upholsterer by trade, he moved to London in 1878 and is believed to have taken up lodgings with the Lamb family at 37 Collingwood Street in Bethnal Green. In 1881, he married Sarah Brighter and moved with her and her family to 21 Cottage Lane. He and Sarah married on June 4th of 1883, and almost from the first points of their marriage, they had violent arguments. On June 21st of 1883, during one of those arguments, Kelly stabbed his wife below her left ear. He was arrested, and she received medical treatment. He was arrested, and she received medical treatment, and she died on June 24th, and on August 1st, Kelly underwent trial for the murder at the Old Bailey, where he was sentenced to death. His execution was fixed for the 20th of August, 1883, but on the 17th he was reprieved and later sent to Broadmoor Asylum, from where he escaped on the 23rd of January, 1888. The problem with suggesting that Kelly was the Ripper is that he remained free until February 11th of 1927, when he gave himself up at the gates of Broadmoor on September 27th of 1929. So, if Kelly was the murderer. He died on September 27th of 1929. He gave himself up in 1927, and he died 2 years later in 1929. So if Kelly was the murderer, why did he stop killing? The theory is that the original argument with Sarah was over the affair with Mary Kelly. Again, Mary Kelly is definitely perhaps the most widely discussed Jack the Ripper suspect. It appears so in this episode as well. After his escape from Broadmoor, he returned to London to be with Mary, but found that she had become a prostitute, so he killed her and all the women with whom He had asked to help find her. Once she was dead, of course, there was no further need to kill. I find it hard to give credence to any theory that postulates that a killer seeking a particular victim and killing all others who got in his way. This is the realm of fiction. More telling is that we have no idea where Kelly was living at the time of the murders, and his description provided by his cousin refers to a dark-haired man with a heavy mustache, details that do not likely fit the description of the killer. Well, I think it's quite possible that Jack the Ripper had a mustache, but that's just me. Okay, now John J. Eddleston seems like he's very harsh on this theory, yet he gave him a 3 out of 5, which is a generous rating to a suspect whom he is going to be very harsh on. But I would say about the same, and just because we don't know all of Kelly's whereabouts and movements, well, this guy was an escapee, and maybe he did commit additional crimes. It's really hard to tell. But there is cause for concern, so I would also give him the 3 out of 5 using this metric. And now, finally, we get to talk about Aaron Kosminski. At first glance, Aaron Kosminski might be considered a very strong suspect because he was named by 2 senior police officials as Jack the Ripper. Initially, only hints were given as to who this suspect was, and Sir Robert Anderson was writing in Criminals and Crime in 1907 that not only did he know the identity of the author of the letters to the Central News Agency, that's the Dear Boss letter and the Saucy Jackie postcard, but he knew the identity of the killer, and he was caged in an asylum. And I'm going to jump ahead. Kosminski's candidacy deserves further examination, but we cannot accept that he was with any degree of certainty Jack the Ripper. He was a shambling wreck who ate bread from the gutters, and hardly the type of man we are looking for. The story of the witness identification is weak to the point of laughability. The policeman who named him, erred in basic facts. Kosminski did not die soon after his incarceration, but he lived until 1919, and if he had been the Ripper, he would have had a period of extended inactivity before his arrest, without any traditional explanation for it. He gets a 3. Now, I've said before, I do think Aaron Kosminski is a very strong suspect. Because he was examined and he is named by officers. But here's the other point. Now, if you're going to look at this just by saying that, well, Kosminski didn't commit any crimes from 1888 to 1891, number one, how do we truly know that? Also, Kosminski didn't go into the asylum until 1891. This whole thing about living in the gutter and eating food when having the phobia of bathing, did he exhibit those behaviors in 1888? I think that Kosminski deserves a higher rating on the list, but that is just me. And overall, this is one where I would like to get you guys to weigh in the comment section. What do you think about any of the Ripper suspects that have been discussed so far? Now, there's a section here in this book just called Masonic Conspiracy. And it's talking about any and all connections to the Masons. And this could range from the royal conspiracy that these people were committed, Masonic tradition. This could also be just that there was a single killer not connected to any of the high-ranking orders, but just somebody who was a Freemason who committed the Jack the Ripper murders on his own accord. And it could also be that he was trying to send messages to people in high-ranking positions, like Sir Charles Warren. And even though this suspect is not named in the book, there's an individual out there named Michael Maybrick. Not James Maybrick, but Michael Maybrick. And he's the suspect of Bruce Robinson, who says that the crimes were committed and they were meant to send a message to Masons like Sir Charles Warren, who ordered the Goulston Street graffito erased because he thought it contained Masonic clues. Okay. Any and all Masonic conspiracies. This is one that I have to include on the list because it says, chance of any protagonists being the Ripper, 0. Chance of any of them being involved, 0. Chance of the gullible being fooled, 5. And I think there's a little bit of twisted humor in there. And I guess I'm going to be one of the people who is a little bit gullible because at first I thought that this theory would have no justification at all. I was thinking that this is just going to be some type of wild conspiracy theory. But when you actually do examine the Masonic conspiracy, it does seem like there could be points that are defendable. And it actually does seem like there could be things that are of Masonic traditions, which I've talked about in some previous episodes. So I guess I'm in the 5 category, but I just thought that any and all things that are related to the Masons, even the idea that Jack the Ripper was just a Freemason and he committed the murders, 0 out of 5. I thought that was a very, very harsh rating. And the next Jack the Ripper suspect is named James Maybrick, whom I said I would come back to. And the long and short of this is, an individual named Michael Barrett came forward, and he said he was in the possession of a diary written by James Maybrick that was signed Jack the Ripper. I have 2 episodes about James Maybrick here on this channel, and the long and short of this is, he gets a 0. I agree. I don't think that James Maybrick was Jack the Ripper. I think the diary was a forgery, and that's the long and short of it. Now, the next one I would like to talk about is the 3rd suspect from the MacNaughton Memoranda, and his name is Michael Ostrog. And I'll just read this here. Michael Ostrog, a habitual criminal who is mentioned as the 3rd likely suspect in the MacNaughton Memoranda. Ostrog, who had several aliases, first came to public attention in 1863 and was sentenced to 10 months imprisonment for thefts at the Oxford colleges. Not one to show preference for any particular university city, he was sentenced to 3 months for being a rogue and vagabond in 1864. And ultimately, he gets a 2 out of 5 for being Jack the Ripper. And I was surprised about this as well, because when you read about Michael Ostrog in our contemporary times, it seems like everyone is just saying that he couldn't have been the Ripper because he was incarcerated in France at the time. So I would give him a 0 on my list, but he gets a 2 there. And next we have one, and this will be the final suspect for this episode here, and it's Dr. Alexander Petachenko. And I said this when I did my own independent suspect profile episode on him. He is one of the most fascinating suspects, and he's the suspect that I always find myself reading up on casually, even if I'm not going to be discussing the material for Ripper Wednesday. Dr. Alexander Petachenko. According to the story, Petachenko, also known as Count Andrei Luiskova, was originally a staff member at a maternity hospital, showing that he would have had the medical expertise supposedly shown by the Ripper. Well, actually, we haven't really talked about too many suspects who were medical doctors, and he supposedly was shown by the Ripper, recruited into the Russian Secret Service, or the Okhrana. He was sent to England in 1888, living in Westmoreland Road, Walworth, with his sister. Acting under orders from the Okhrana, he allegedly committed the murders and was assisted by accomplices named Levitsky and Miss Winberg in order to discredit the Metropolitan Police. Of course, the plot was a brilliant success, as Sir Charles Warren, the Mason, although that doesn't say that in the book, he's just called Sir Charles Warren, but yes, Sir Charles Warren, the Mason, was even forced to resign. Petachenko was smuggled back to Russia, but by then he had a taste for killing and murdered another woman. He was then confined to a mental institution. The entire story is drawn from a document supposedly dictated by Rasputin and other information supplied by Johann Niederrest, a Swiss man who sold information to newspapers, and Nicholas Zveriev, an anarchist based in London. It has also been stated that the Okhrana knew that Petachenko was an alias, and the killer's real name was Vasily Konovalov. Stories of Russian plots and spies and conspiracies should be treated with skepticism, as there is not the slightest evidence that Petachenko even existed. Most likely the entire story is a myth, and it's the real-life tale of Dr. Panchenko. And I'm not familiar with the story of Dr. Panchenko, so that is going to be one that I'm going to have to explore in the future. But no, the reason why I think that the story involving Dr. Alexander Petachenko is so enthralling is, was he even a real person? And also, the murder that they're talking about that he committed in Russia would have been in St. Petersburg, and did that actually happen? Is this just a wild set of events that have been created by Johann Niederrest? And when I did the independent episode on Alexander Petachenko, I also encountered that Johann Niederrest was somebody who had a reputation for making up stories, and this is even discussed in the Encyclopedia of Jack the Ripper, or I should call it Jack the Ripper, an Encyclopedia by John J. Eddleston. In other parts of the book, he says that sometimes these people who are working with newspapers made things up to be more sensational. Petachenko gets a 0. Yeah, for being Jack the Ripper, I also give him a 0. but I still want to know more about the story, and I still have some genuine elements of curiosity. But what do you think? Do you agree or disagree with any of the suspects that I've talked about on this list? Is there a suspect that you wanted to hear about that was not included in this episode? And as I said, I wanted to focus on the suspects that were number one mentioned in the book, and number two that I've also done my own episodes about here on Black Box Online Radio. What do you think about any of these things? Would you like to dispute anything from either John J. Eddleston or from me? And one more time, the book is Jack the Ripper, an Encyclopedia. And that will be all for me now. My name is Ned DeHaan, and I have been your host. Anybody can write the show at blackboxonlineradio@AOL.com. You can also get me on Facebook. My personal Facebook is in the description box. And there is always BlackBoxNed88 on Instagram. And for the summer, I will be going live on Tuesdays and Thursdays at 10:30 a.m. So please stop by for True Crime Talk Radio in the morning with me, Black Box Ned. And that will be all for me now. Until next time.